Welcome to this NWCC webinar, updates on research presented at the 12th NWCC Wind Wildlife Research Meeting. I am Paige Johnson with the American Wind Wildlife Institute. And so before we get started with the content of the presentation, I want to note that you should be able to hear us now through your computer speakers. If you're having difficulty with your computer speakers or don't have that capability, you are welcome to call into the phone line. The number is there on your screen and within your registration as well. But please make sure to mute your lines so that we don't get background noise. If you have any technical trouble during the webinar, you can either put a question in the Q&A box on your screen, or you can send an email to support@kernswest.com. That email address is also in the notes box on your webinar screen. And we'll have a few presenters today, and we'll have time for a short Q&A session after each presentation. So if you have questions for the presenters, you can enter those in the Q&A box. And just a note that you will only be able to see the questions that you submitted and not those submitted by others. So we will read the questions out loud for the presenters to respond to. And you can type in questions anytime they come up, and we will read those questions after the presentations as time permits. We've got a fairly tight webinar today with several speakers. And another note that we are recording this webinar, and the recording will be posted on the NWCC website within a few days, as will copies of the presentations given on the webinar today. So all of that will be available on the website. All right. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Tabor Allison, AWI's Director of Research and the past chair of the Wind Wildlife Research Meeting. Reminder, everyone, if you need to chat with each other, try and find another way to do it, please, because we are in a webinar with a number of folks. So please put your phone on mute, and then I'm going to pass it over to Tabor, and he's going to give a little bit of background and overview of the research meeting and also introduce our speakers. So Tabor, whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you, Paige, and welcome everybody to this NWCC webinar. We have, as Paige mentioned, we have 3 different presentations for you today, and these 3 presentations are or build on work by the presenters that has been presented at previous NWCC Wind Wildlife Research meetings. And I want to take a little bit of time just to talk about the meeting and remind people about the meetings in general and the upcoming meeting. The Wind Wildlife Research meeting, sponsored by the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative, occurs every other year and has representation really from all wind wildlife stakeholders. We have over 400 people attending and approximately 100 papers and posters presented at the meeting featuring the latest in wind wildlife research. A little background, the Wind Wildlife Research meeting began back in 1994 as then the National Avian Wind Power Planning Meeting, which was a subcommittee.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
Can you all hear me? I'm sorry, Paige. I got a mute message.
Sounded like you cut out for a minute there, but I can still hear you, and we're getting a note from others that we can still hear you. So
okay, great.
Please proceed.
My phone told me that I'd been muted, so just checking. Okay.
Thanks for checking.
So in 2004, the meeting was expanded to a broader wind wildlife research meeting. And in total, there have been 12 meetings since 1994. AWWI assumed the role of organizing the Wind Wildlife Research meeting in 2012. And we also manage the NWCC website, and you can see the link here on the screen where you can find proceedings from past meetings. Very useful place to go if you're interested in the history of wind wildlife research. Our most recent meeting, the 12th meeting, was held in St. Paul at the end of November in 2018. As I mentioned, we had over 100 papers and posters, as well as pre-meeting workshops on offshore wind energy and training on the generalized estimator, or GenEst. Our 13th meeting is coming up December 1st through 4th in 2020, so just a year away. And we anticipate, again, having a full spectrum of presentations and posters covering the latest research in onshore and offshore wind energy in the U.S. and abroad. The location has yet to be determined.
Looks like you got, hold on, technical trouble. Sorry, everybody.
Yeah. And AWWI, as I mentioned, assumes responsibility for planning and organizing the meeting, but we also do that with a tremendous amount of input from the wind wildlife stakeholder community. And every meeting we form an advisory committee that we consult with as we organize the meeting. And if you are interested and willing to participate, volunteer, please send an email to the address noted on the screen. And also note that we will be sending out more information as it becomes available. So put those dates in your calendar, and we hope we see you all next year. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have 3 presentations today that build off of work that the presenters have presented at past wind wildlife research meetings. And I'll introduce all the presenters now. As Paige mentioned, we will have time for questions after each presentation. But our first presenter is Jill Schaefer of the U.S. Geological Survey, who will be presenting on offsetting behavioral displacement and avian-impact offset method. Jill is an ecologist with USGS at their Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center. And she has, since 2002, been evaluating the effects of land use change on grassland and wetland birds, and has conducted a long-term study looking at the response of grassland birds to wind energy facility operation. Our second speaker, in what you might call a companion presentation, Chuck Lurch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, offsetting behavioral displacement, applying spatial models and decision support tools to address habitat offsets. Chuck is a wildlife biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service and works in the prairie pothole region and has focused specifically on assessing the effects of various stressors on breeding waterfowl and their spatial use in the landscape. Also with a focus on wind energy development. And our third and final speaker is Catherine Yardine of Bird Studies Canada, who will be talking about the Motus Wildlife Tracking Network and its applications to wind energy research. Catherine is a data analyst, at Bird Studies Canada. And in addition to working on the Motus Wildlife Tracking Network, she manages the National Wind Energy Bird and Bat Monitoring Database that BSC manages for Canada. So with that, I will pass the baton over to Jill, who will begin with our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabor. Paige, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear, and your presentation is loading, and as soon as you see your slides, you can take it away.
Awesome. Okay. So in previously published research, Deb, Chuck, and I established that grassland birds and waterfowl exhibit behavioral displacement to wind facilities. Building on those findings, we have recently determined how to offset that displacement. Our method, which we term the Avian-Impact offset method, quantifies displacement of birds by anthropogenic disturbances. Today I'm going to be focusing on wind as the anthropogenic disturbance, but be aware that this method also applies to other sources of anthropogenic disturbance, including oil and gas development as well as roads. Essentially, the Avian-Impact offset method determines the number of hectares of grasslands or wetlands necessary to support displaced breeding bird pairs. This method was released earlier this year in the journal Ecological Applications, and it was based on work that Chuck and his co-authors with the Fish and Wildlife Service and DU conducted that was published in a 2013 Journal of Wildlife Management paper that established that waterfowl displacement to wind energy does occur. Whereas Deb and I worked on the issue of grassland bird avoidance to wind facilities and showed that avoidance occurs in a 2016 conservation biology paper. So based on these two papers, which served as foundational data for our ecological applications paper, in that paper, in the 2019 paper, we explain how to calculate percent displacement, and in turn then, that allowed us to develop the Avian-Impact offset method. I am going to first discuss how we apply the method to grassland birds and give some background on the data there. So Deb and I looked at 9 species of birds, 8 of which are considered grassland specialist species, 6 of which are pictured in this slide. And I see, for some reason, the Vesper sparrow, there it is. Okay. These 2 top species are also considered grassland bird specialists, whereas the only generalist species included in our research was the killdeer. Our research occurred over a 10-year period. We worked on 3 wind facilities in North Dakota and South Dakota. We worked at NextEra Energy's Oliver Wind Farm and their South Dakota Wind Energy Center, as well as working on Acciona Tatanka's project that straddles the 2 states. And we did employ a before-after control impact study design. We define displacement as the change in density on treatment sites from the pre to the post-treatment years relative to the reference sites. This is an aerial photo of the South Dakota Wind Energy Center, at least a portion of it, where the blue polygons represent the treatment sites, those that have turbines, and the yellow polygons represent our control or reference sites. We looked at the change in density from the pre-treatment year to the post-treatment year on the reference sites to determine kind of like a baseline change that represents annual variation in a population of grassland birds, so a change you would expect to occur naturally due to such things as precipitation or other naturally occurring events, and that this change would also be expected to occur on the treatment sites. So therefore, any change that we determined on the treatment sites after the turbines were built, we ascribed to a displacement effect if the change in density was negative. We did find a prevalence of displacement. We looked at displacement in 4 discrete distance categories as listed here, and you will see that the majority of displacement events occurred within 300 meters. So what I just discussed was all published in the Conservation Biology 2016 paper. What I will now discuss is what is presented in the 2019 Ecological Applications paper. So for the purposes of estimating percent displacement, we excluded that 1 generalist species and focused only on the 8 grassland specialists. We computed percent displacement for 3 distance categories, those that were out to 300 meters, by each of the years of our study. and for each of the 3 wind facilities, and then averaged across the wind facilities. So that table, or excuse me, let me go through the steps for how we actually estimated percent displacement. The first thing that we did is we calculated a predicted avian density, and to do this we calculated the total density of those 8 focal grassland specialist species by summing their densities as predicted from the ANOVA models in the Schaefer and Buell 2016 paper, and we did this for both the reference sites and the turbine sites for both the pre and the post-treatment years. We then, the next step was to look at what the expected avian densities for the turbine sites by distance category for each year post-treatment would be based on percent change from the pre to the post-treatment year for the reference sites. So basically we're looking at the ratio of the post-treatment density to the pre-treatment density multiplied by the pre-treatment density on the turbine sites. We then computed the difference between the predicted and the expected, and this difference is assumed to be the number of birds displaced by the wind facility. The next step was to take that value divided by the expected, multiply it by 100 to get a percent. And so this then is the table that displays our findings. And a couple of things I want to point out here. We did look at the difference every year post-treatment, but we're not comparing one year to the second year or second year to the third year. What you're looking at are cumulative averages as the years post-treatment progress. I want you to note there was no 4th year post-treatment at any wind facility just due to logistical constraints. So the bottom line here is that on this study system, on these 3 wind facilities, the average displacement for those 8 focal grassland bird species by the 5th year post-treatment was 53%. So now let me turn to waterfowl and the work of Chuck and his co-authors. They looked at 5 species of dabbling ducks, these 5 species pictured here. Chuck and his co-authors worked on the Axionis Tatanka farm, as did I, but they worked on one additional farm, the Cullum Edgeley Wind Farm. They had paired reference sites, so they controlled for changes or differences in wetland and landscape characteristics by having paired reference sites. And then what you're looking at here is the percent difference of the pair estimates on the wind versus the reference sites. So breeding duck pair data were used to run predictive models for each of the 3 years of their study on the 2 wind sites for the 5 waterfowl species combinations. You'll notice their model is run on seasonal wetlands, and that's because that's the most numerous wetland class within the study area, but it is also the most important wetland class to these 5 species of dabbling ducks in terms of productivity. The median size of seasonal wetlands was, 0.2 hectares. That's where that value comes from. What's important for you here to note, and I'm going to grab my pointer here and see if I can get this to work. The red line there, estimates below that 100% horizontal line indicate displacement. Okay, so anytime you see that red line and estimates below that, that indicates displacement. Where there's a lack of overlap of the credible interval lines, these thin lines between the horizontal line, that indicates significance. So as you can see, 26 of 30 of these comparisons shows some degree of displacement. So breeding duck pairs do not completely avoid wetlands at wind farms. This is true. It's the same thing we found for grassland birds. But overall, negative impacts were observed for the majority of cases where this was examined, to the tune that significant displacement occurred in over half of the comparisons. When you provide or look at an average, the average percent displacement in the Lesh et al. Study system was 18% for those 5 species of dabbling ducks. So let's bring this all together. Deb and I found average displacement for 8 grassland specialist species of 53% by the 5th year post-treatment, whereas Chuck and his collaborators found an average of 18% displacement of breeding waterfowl pairs. We will be using these numbers in the Avian-Impact offset method, which essentially tries to answer how many hectares of grasslands and wetlands are necessary to support displaced breeding bird pairs, be it waterfowl or grassland birds. To employ this method, one needs to know values for 5 metrics, 4 on the impact site, so that's your turbine facility, or excuse me, your wind facility, or your oil and gas facility, or your road infrastructure. The offset metric, that is going to occur on an area you set aside that you find to do compensatory mitigation on. So let's look at each of these metrics. You need to know the impact distance. So that's the linear distance for which energy or some other type of anthropogenic infrastructure influences bird behavior. You would need to know the spatial extent of habitat affected within that buffer zone. You need to know the pre-impact avian density. So what is the number of birds per hectare on the site prior to disturbance? And then you need to know the percent of birds displaced due to the anthropogenic change. On the offset site, you need to know the number of birds per hectare. So again, how many birds are on that site. Let's step through the Avian-Impact offset method for a few examples. We'll start with a grassland bird and wind example, and then a grassland bird and oil and gas example, and followed up with a waterfowl and wind example. So here we're going to look at a hypothetical 6-turbine string wind farm in a typical prairie pothole region landscape in North Dakota. Our impact distance based on Schaefer and Buell 2016 is 300 meters. Recall that the prevalence of avoidance we found was within 300 meters of wind turbines. A simple GIS analysis tells us that the impact area is 112 hectares. The pre-impact density, avian density of 1.9 breeding bird pairs per hectare, we're getting this from the ANOVA models in the Schaefer and Buell 2016 paper. And then, of course, that percent displacement, I've already defined that. So step 1, how many breeding pairs would you expect within this impact area? That's pretty simply area times density. So we would expect 213 grassland bird pairs of those 8 focalist species to occur within this system. Step 2, how many of those would possibly be displaced due to the construction of the 6 turbines? That's P times R, so the number of pairs times our displacement rate of 53%. About 113 breeding bird pairs out of those 213 are expected to be displaced by the 6 turbines. How much habitat would need to be mitigated to offset that displacement? Here we have to look at the avian density on the treatment site versus the avian density on that site that's set aside for compensatory mitigation. And here, when we talk about equivalent biological value, we're talking about that in terms of avian density numbers. So for simplification for this example, I have said that the avian density is equal to on the offset site as on the impact site. So they have equivalent biological value, in other words. Therefore, when you plug this into the formula, you would need 59 hectares of grassland to offset those 113 breeding bird pairs. The formula, because the avian density on the impact site and the offset site are equal, the formula actually simplifies to area times displacement rate. However, you cannot simplify the formula if your offset site is not of equivalent biological value as your impact site. So here I'm going to give an example where that offset site actually has lower biological value in the sense that it has fewer, only 1.5 pairs of birds per hectare, okay? So as you might expect, if your offset site is of lower biological value, you're going to need more grassland acres, 75 hectares here, to offset those 113 breeding bird pairs. Okay, now let's just briefly talk about applying this method to the oil and gas. A paper came out in Biological Conservation written by Sarah Thompson, Doug Johnson, Neil Nemeth, and Chris Ribick, in which fortuitously for Deb and Chuck and I, they provided all of the values that we needed to plug into the Avian-Impact offset method, and we did that. And based on their work in the Bakken region of northwestern North Dakota, we determined that the example they gave, you would need to offset the birds displaced from their example with 311 hectares. So if oil and gas displacement is of interest to you, I urge you to look up that biological conservation paper. But let's return to waterfowl and wind now. We're going to use our hypothetical 6-turbine string wind farm to show you how to apply the Avian-Impact offset method to a waterfowl example because it's a little bit different. Here, our impact distance is 800 meters, and this is based on biological factors explained in Lesh et al. 2013. For waterfowl, our impact area is based on number of wetland basins. And so a GIS analysis will tell us that with our 800-meter buffer zone, there are 109 wetland basins, and I know it doesn't look like that on the aerial photo, but there's a lot of those little small temporaries and seasonals probably not showing up real clearly. The pre-impact density of 1.82 duck pairs I will explain in the next slide, before briefly just reminding you that average percent displacement for waterfowl is 18%. So where did I get 1.82 duck pairs for the pre-impact density? Well, here I turned to, or Chuck, Deb, and I turned to models run by the Fish and Wildlife Service. They've had a very long-term survey in play, the 4 square mile waterfowl survey. It's been run since 1987 in the part of the country where our example occurs, the prairie pothole region. And based on that long-term survey, we were able to determine that within our hypothetical wind farm area, one would expect 1.82 duck pairs per wetland to occur there. So we plugged that into our formula to calculate the number of breeding pairs within the impact area. So the 109 wetlands should yield the 198 duck pairs. How many of those will be displaced? Well, you multiply that by the displacement rate, and about 36 of those waterfowl pairs are expected to be displaced by those 6 turbines. So how much habitat do you need to offset that displacement? You're going to wonder where that 4.45 density comes from on an offset site. And here again, we're going to turn to Fish and Wildlife Service models, specifically models developed by the Habitat and Population Evaluation Team out of Bismarck. They have modeled the geographical distribution of the attractiveness of breeding duck pairs to 0.9 hectare seasonal wetlands throughout the entire prairie pothole region area. And the area in which our hypothetical example is occurring should have 4.45 duck pairs. So we're going to plug that into our formula, and this tells us that we need 8 wetlands. But 8 wetlands isn't a hectare value, and we want to get this down to hectares. So we're going to take those 8 wetlands, and we're going to multiply it by 0.9, and that 0.9 hectares is coming from the average size seasonal wetland restored by the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service in this area. So recall the importance of seasonal wetlands to waterfowl in this area. It's the most prevalent, it's the most important class to these species of ducks for production, such that the Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service mostly restore seasonal wetlands, and the average size seasonal wetland they restore is 0.9 hectares. That's where that value comes from. When you plug that into the Avian-Impact offset method formula, you arrive at needing 7.2 hectares of wetland. So let's bring this all together then. In our hypothetical example, if you were to offset for those displaced breeding grassland bird pairs, you would need 59 hectares of grassland to do that. And to offset those waterfowl pairs displaced by those 6 turbines, you would need 7 hectares of seasonal wetlands. So in this talk, I have shown to you that avian displacement occurs. Displacement can be calculated by applying the Avian-Impact offset method, and the cost of mitigation can also be calculated. And with that, I'm going to turn the next phase of this project over to Chuck Lesh, who's going to talk about the complementary decision support tools that help a person actually implement the Avian-Impact offset method.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. We've had a few questions come in for you, and we have a few minutes here. Is it okay for you to go ahead and answer a few questions before we turn it over to Chuck?
Sure.
Okay, great. So one question is, did you find that killdeer were attracted to the roads or turbine pads?
Yes, we did. Killdeer was the only species that did exhibit attraction. And as people who understand the biology of killdeer know, they make their nests in scrapes of bare ground, such as gravel. And so when the wind developers put all those wonderful gravel-based roads out on the native prairie, the killdeer really appreciated that habitat. However, in later years, we found that the killdeer perhaps we're just theorizing, but they weren't as attracted several years post-treatment, and it may be that they actually did not have high reproductive success on those roads, possibly due to the traffic from turbine maintenance, or maybe because predators were using those as travel lanes.
Great, thank you. So I've got 2 questions here that are related, so I'm going to bundle them together. And one is asking if we know where the displaced birds are going. And the second question is asking if there would end up being too many birds in the habitat being used as offset if you have both the birds already using that habitat and if the displaced birds are using that habitat, meaning that there could be an increased density and competition for resources.
We did not have any of the birds tagged in any way, so we can't answer where the birds went, whether they successfully bred elsewhere, whether they didn't even attempt breeding. We don't have the answer to that. And can you repeat the second part of that question?
Well, the question was asking if the case was that the displaced birds were using the habitat that was being used as offset, could that then increase the density and then potentially increase competition for resources in those offset areas? But it sounds like if you don't know that the birds are being displaced to those areas, then you might not be able to answer that question.
Well, that question is based on the assumption that the offset site is located within some reasonable distance of the impact site, that the birds that were displaced could move over to that area. And we're not making that assumption. Some of the models and some of the work that Chuck will explain show that there's options in terms of where this offset site could be. It may not be adjacent to the impact site in such a way that one might assume that the birds are just hopping over to another site.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. Another question is asking, why do you use number of wetland basins instead of the total area of wetland basins?
We just chose to do number of wetlands, but it could be done with this area. You could actually do it either way. Just in our example, we use number. But you could easily plug area of wetlands in the formula just like we did with area of grassland.
Okay, great. And I'm going
to... That was my co-author, Deb Buell.
Thanks. I'm going to read one more question here, which is asking if there are any indications if the birds that are displaced, if they recolonize at a later time. And the question is getting at whether displacement could be due to construction disturbance rather than long-term disturbance.
Yeah, and again, you know, we didn't have any birds marked, so we can't make any definitive comment on where the birds displaced go. We also don't have any definitive data on exactly what mechanism displaced these birds, whether it was the roads or the turbine construction or the turbine operation or what have you.
All right, well, great. Thanks for clarifying. So now we are going to move over to Chuck, who will be presenting a related topic.
So yeah, I'll be picking up kind of where Jill left off. What I want to talk to you folks about today is how we've kind of made the next step and said, okay, we have compiled this information, we've identified a method, and how would somebody go about using the method that we have? Please advance. So the purpose of my presentation today, very simply, is to introduce or reiterate the method that Jill's already covered very thoroughly and demonstrate some geospatial tools that I've developed to assist the user in applying that method from a waterfowl and a grassland bird perspective. So we have an automated process for waterfowl, a manual process for potentially identifying offsets, and then an automated tool for identifying the amount of and potential locations of offsets. So a little bit of background. We had the information. At one point in time, I was producing some white papers interacting with some folks that were concerned about wind energy that kind of tied some of the duck things together, the whole idea of the different metrics. And it got to the point where that just wasn't good enough anymore. And so Jill and I collaborated on and Deb on the manuscript that she mentioned and developed this so-called method. The metrics that were identified by Jill are going to be used within the geospatial approach that I'm going to be presenting. I stepped back when we were most of the way through the manuscript, and I said to myself, if I'm a biologist and I have to sit down and glean through this paper and apply this, quote, method, how easy is it? Because that's a big part of doing anything. How doable is it? Or is it a real pain or more complicated than the authors expect it to be? And I did that. I sat down and I realized, even though it seems very simple, it maybe isn't as simple as we thought. So as part of the manuscript, we produced a non-spatial worksheet that allows the user to plug information into this spreadsheet and generate the results similar to what Jill presented in her presentation. And so that's fine. If you have the numbers in front of you, you can easily sit down and plug the information into here. But it's analog, it's paper, it's non-spatial, and I live in a spatial world. We all do, so I thought, well, I should probably sit down and with some geospatial skills that I have, build a tool set to help automate the process and allow the use of current spatial data to apply the method. So I did that. I used within the ArcGIS world, GIS software. It's not available in ArcPro at this point in time, but in the ArcGIS software, I've developed the toolbox. Oh, and I haven't been asking you to advance. I'm sorry. God dang it. This is more complicated than I wish it was. So I'm actually on slide number 6, which is okay because the other stuff. Can you go to slide 5 for me, please?
So I'm on slide, let's see,
5.
Slide 5, non-spatial worksheet. Is that right?
Yeah. So this is a non-spatial worksheet that's part of the manuscript that was the Schaefer et al. Manuscript. And so this is in there. I'm a geospatial person. We all live in a geospatial world. So if you can advance to the next slide, please. I developed the tool set and have within that context produce some methods or instructions for using the tools. There's a couple tools in here. And then there's some, if your questions are in the prairie pothole region and they're about grassland birds and or ducks, there's some supporting data that HAPIT can provide, the office that I work for, can provide to help automate and make this process a little bit easier to go through. Please advance. So I'm going to talk about ducks first, since that's my area of expertise. Within the toolbox that you can see is highlighted in blue, it's named the Avian Offset method, and there's two models within there, two tools, one for breeding duck pairs and one for grassland, at least 6 species of grassland birds. Next slide, please. So to inform the model, we're pulling a bunch of information out of what Jill talked about, especially 1, 2, and 3, where she identified for ducks this half mile. There's some information out of Lesh et al., the 18% displacement, and the idea that we have good information to estimate the value of the habitat, the wetland habitat, for breeding ducks. When we talk about, so that's the starting pre-impact density. For post-impact density, we have, the question was asked, why are you talking about wetlands and not acres of wetland? And part of it's because of the idea that not all wetland acres are created equal for waterfowl. It depends where you are spatially and what class of wetland it is. So it starts to become, and we don't restore all types of wetlands. If we're talking about offsets from a restoration perspective, we don't pick and choose which wetlands to restore. We try to restore them all if we get an opportunity. So what I did is I looked into, to look at a value of a wetland, relative value of a wetland in a location, I looked into data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife program that restores a lot of wetlands in the prairies. And when I do that, I find that most of those are seasonal. The vast majority are seasonal in nature, and they're roughly 2 acres in size. And so when we start to talk about numbers of wetlands, we can estimate ducks and relate that back to how many duck pairs we could expect on a wetland of a given size, and now we have numbers of wetlands to restore as opposed to X number of acres, when different sizes of wetlands matter, the larger they get, the lower densities we tend to see on wetlands. And so from a breeding duck perspective, so it all matters. Jill talked a little bit about it. And so we use estimates per county to help us understand how many wetlands we might need to restore in that particular area to offset the lost value within a particular wind facility. Next slide, please. So if you start to run the tool, you see there's a number of inputs that are available in the dialog box. I don't have the arrow handy because I'm not logged into there, but the idea is we have turbine sites. In this case, turbines are points. And so we have a point layer in the geospatial software. The linear distance is user defined, so if you're working with something other than waterfowl and you want to put a different distance in there, whatever might work, you have the opportunity to manually input the linear distance of the buffer area, the offset distance, or the impact distance. And then we have some pointers to where to store particular pieces of information that get generated by the tool, and an opportunity to identify the percent displacement as well, depending on what species. In this case, we use 18% as the default for waterfowl in this geography because of the results of Lesh et al. 2013. And the process calculates a table through a series of intersects and summarizations to generate an output table. Advance to the next slide, please. That produces the following information. If you focus on the table, so the image back there is just some layers of the different pieces of information that are being generated and intersected and clipped and summarized. And the outcome for this particular wind facility, we estimate about 5,600 pairs are associated with wetland communities within the buffer area, within the impact area, with an avoidance of 18%, suggests that about 1,000 pairs are displaced from the impact area. For about a 2-acre seasonal wetland in the general, within the county where this facility is located, we estimate an average of about 7.5 pairs per 2-acre seasonal wetland. So we can use that information, 7 pairs per wetland, along with the number of displaced pairs, and estimate about 136 wetlands of the average size and class, seasonal, 2 acres, would need to be restored to offset the displacement from the wind facility. So that's where we start to talk about wetlands instead of acres, because we're using this standard 2-acre wetland as the most restored, most likely to be restored wetland. We can get a finer resolution from that if the information is available, and I'll give you an example of that. Because we have more, because I have access to the data I have access to, I can take a look at locations within the prairie pothole region, and there's a number of things that to consider. One is there's lots of drain wetlands in the prairie pothole region, so finding drain wetlands is not an issue. Finding drain wetlands where the landowner wishes for them to be restored is a little bit different matter, but they're out there. What we also have learned is that when hydrology is restored to those drain wetlands, at least from a duck perspective, the flora and fauna that responds is very similar to undrained wetlands, and ducks respond to them very well. We can use other data sets out there, such as LIDAR, to help us identify a potential restored area, and then use these pair attractiveness models applied to those restored wetlands to get a much more detailed idea of, if I go to a given location, restore the wetlands at that location, is it enough to offset the impact of a development? And so, an example, I just have a quick example, because at one point in time I was working with a manager of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they had a piece of ground that they had identified and worked with the landowner. It had a lot of potential restorable wetlands. That landowner went in, or excuse me, the manager went in and identified where they might. Can you please advance the slide to slide 12? I'm sorry.
Nope, we got it.
So the idea is that there's a bunch of places where we could easily restore some wetlands using plugs. Next slide. I can combine that information with terrain data from LIDAR to get an idea of what the topography is as relates to those different plugs and previously drained wetlands. Next slide. And I can then build contours and start to look at what the potential surface water is for those wetlands. I can make some assumptions about the class. Next slide. And predict pairs for each of those water bodies. And they're a little bit difficult to see, but by having those pairs associated with individual wetlands, next slide, I can start to summarize and select those basins until I get to a level that approximates the displacement offset estimate. In this case, I've identified 25 wetlands that, if they were restored and functioned, they would result in habitat for about 50 pairs. So this is a whole different level of resolution that can be attained if the resources, time, and data are available to dig into property-related restoration activities that maybe can be used and drill in finer than the idea of X number of wetlands, assuming most of them are going to be 2-acre seasonal wetlands. So a little bit different way of approaching it, an actual restoration opportunity than the conceptually, here's the acres, here's the number of wetlands. Let's go try and restore that number of wetlands and figure out what that's going to entail. All right, next slide, please. I'm going to switch gears and talk a bit about grassland birds. Next slide. Just a little bit of information here that I'm going to repeat. Jill did a great job of talking about the top 2/3 of this, or the top third of it, excuse me. What we often don't have for a location, and maybe this isn't quite the case for wind, I know there's a lot of surveys that potentially go on before and or after, during or after construction and operation, but a lot of times we don't have good information on abundance, and that's kind of what we're talking about, the abundance or density of birds as a pre-impact and a post-impact situation. And so we can use models, and what we've used are some models developed by my colleague Neil Nemeth and others, and published in 2017 in Condor, that uses breeding bird survey data and landscape land cover information, habitat data, to build probability of occurrence models across landscapes as opposed to local locations. And so these models are applied to the National Land Cover Data Set, and so what I was able to do is work with Neil to obtain some probability of occurrence data, which Neil can can clarify if need be or whatever, but the idea is that these probability of occurrences are very highly correlated with relative abundance as well. So we're using them in that context, that if one area shows as being better than another location, it's relative in value, and so we can attain at least similar relative values of a particular location. I've built some geoprocessing steps within ArcGIS that utilize 6 species worth of data that were available from Nemeth et al. And correspond with 6 species within the work that Jill and Deb did and published previously. And then as far as assessing the particular value of the habitat at an impact site, I use the average of the values, the probability of occurrence values, as a representation of the value of that location for grassland bird habitat. So, advance the slide. So what we have is a tool that you can activate within ArcGIS, and it's asking, again, for the turbine site that needs to know where those things are. The buffer distance as a linear unit, and again, we're using 300 meters from Jill and Deb's work, and from the most recent publication, 53% displacement. And then it's going to ask about a whole bunch of places to store data that's going to get created as the result of the model run. Next slide, please. This is an example of what the probability of occurrence values look like for the 6 combined species for North Dakota. The red is higher, the blues are lower. The average, or the high, is about 2 individuals, and the low is near 0. So let's advance to the next slide. If I intersect at least the upland area of the impact area, some of this is not grassland in the impact, in this particular impact area. So we're looking at the compatible habitats, the grass type habitats, not wetlands. Wetlands are dealt with in a different situation as they relate to waterfowl. And so we're looking at compatible habitat, and we can see that the dark green is compatible and the blank is non-compatible habitat. So for the sites of the overlap where the compatible habitat within the impact area overlaps with the values for the probability of occurrence information, the range, the area mean for those values is about 0.94, and you compare it to the range for North Dakota of 0.01 up to 2. So it's pretty good. It's middle of the road stuff. but it's pretty good for the 6 species. Next slide, please. So to get the acres of habitat of value, we used the areas above and below the mean of the impact site. So we're only looking at the habitat that is above the mean of the impact site. So if we scroll to the next slide, we find out that the mean for the habitat above is 0.73 across the entire state. Next slide, please. And so the next step in the process is to try and filter through lots of, filter through potentially undesirable habitat from a conservation perspective in the surrounding landscape. So we have a threshold of 0.73 as our mean, and now I want to look at the habitat outside of the project area that is above 0.73, but I also want to filter out small patches because we have consideration for area-sensitive species. And we reference the Grassland Bird Conservation Area, it's a publication of Johnson et al., and I'd have to look at in 2010, I believe. And it's a process that looks at compatible habitats, grassland, alfalfa, planted grass, native grass, and looks at those and builds patches. In this case, identifies areas that are 55 acres or larger of those compatible habitats. And we can use that to identify potential offset sites for that offset acreage. Next slide. I think I missed one thing, but that's okay. So the end product is a map that looks something like this, where we have the turbine sites and the buffers, the impact area. We have existing land protection, that's the pinkish color. In this case, we also have grassland bird conservations that are above the mean abundance probability of occurrence values that are found for the impact sites. So those are habitats that are at least as valuable or more valuable from a probability of occurrence and numbers of birds perspective than that are above the mean probability of occurrence. And the green is also grass patches, but they have probability of occurrence values lower than the mean. And so basically what you have is an idea of where habitat exists that's at least as suitable as the location where the impact is. And the next slide, please. And we can look at, there's also a table that gets spit out of the process that identifies the offset acres that would be required to reclaim that lost biological benefit as a result of the displacement in the impact area. In this case, within the buffer areas for habitats that are compatible, there's about 1,700 acres. 0.53 displacement, so 53%. If we're looking for equal habitat value or better, we're looking at about 925 acres of offset habitat. The question is, and this is where the science deviates from the management decisions, is what sort of offset is whoever is the individual looking for, the client, whoever, the developer, the state, whomever, is if there's an offset that is being desired, there's a couple different ways you can do mitigation. We have averted loss options for mitigation, which we see a lot of times, whether that's the best way to go or not. It's not the best because it's a loss, right? If you only protect what still remains, it's a net loss. The only way to get net neutral is to restore habitats that are at least as valuable or can provide habitats that are as valuable biologically as the offset that was estimated. So you could restore habitat, you have a whole different issues with that. How long before it becomes fully functional? Does it ever fully replace the value of the habitat that's been impacted? Those are different questions. The idea is that conceptually, if you created a piece of grass, restored it, and it was of equal biological benefit, you would need about 925 acres. So it's just an idea of, okay, well, how can I use this outcome to help plan or start a discussion about how some impacts might be addressed and offset. So it seems like a lot of information, and the idea is to make it simple, but it gets kind of complicated, and things that are simple for one person are not always simple for another. So that's a big reason that I went ahead and created these geospatial tools so folks could use them and play with them. As far as the duck stuff for estimating offsets, that's available. Grassland birds, that's available. That whole idea of the process of identifying restorable wetlands and their value, that's kind of a documented process, but it's not automated. The person needs resources to do that. Next slide. And you even have to tell me what slide you're on.
I'm on the question slide at the very end, Chuck, and we are out of time for you. So if you want to just wrap it up here real quick.
Yep, that's it. The bottom line is the tools are available. I have them online and they can be shared. These are the links. I don't expect you to write them down. If my email address is on the slide, correct?
Yep, it is there.
Contact me, and I would be more than happy to share these links with you so you can download it and experiment. Contact me with any questions.
Great, thanks so much. And a reminder that we will be posting PDFs of these slides on the NWCC website, so you'll be able to access the links there as well. So we have run out of time for questions for Chuck. If anyone on the webinar, if anyone has questions specifically for Chuck about these models and tools, go ahead and either enter them in the Q&A, or you can send an email either to me or to the support email in the notes section there, and we will see if Chuck can answer them by email after the webinar. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to share her screen so she can show us a few videos during her presentation. So Catherine, take it away.
All right, thank you, everybody. I'll be talking about the Motus wildlife tracking system today, and to begin with, we will talk about what Motus is for those of you who don't know. So essentially, in order to make appropriate management and development decisions, we need to understand how animals use the landscape throughout their annual cycle, and that results in a need to track animals between different populations and different habitats. There's multiple different technologies that exist to track animals. Radio telemetry is one of the oldest methods, but recent technological advances have breathed new life into radio telemetry, specifically through digitally coded tags and automated radio telemetry systems. So that's what Motus is. It is a collaborative approach to radio telemetry. And what that means is all of the tags are using the same frequency and code sets, and then there's automated receivers, silent listening stations that are set out across the landscape. All that infrastructure is shared between all the projects using the network, and all the data flows from all of those stations that are set out across the landscape into one database and then back out to any researchers who are using the network. So essentially it comes down to being a collaborative network for research and conservation with the shared cost of infrastructure and shared data. So it all starts with these small tags, these Motus tags. They are all on the same frequency and they weigh between 0.2 and 3 grams with a detection distance of around 10 to 20 kilometers. They have really high temporal and geographic precision. And the nice thing is the animals do not need to be recaptured. And the reason for that is there are these Motus stations that exist on the landscape, and the data from the tags is picked up by these stations and then sent back to the database for processing, and then it makes its way back to researchers. I'm just going to show you what that looks like on a broader scale. So you have an animal moving across the landscape. It passes within a stationary tower. The signal is picked up. And as these stations are set up across North America, we would be able to link multiple detections together and determine migratory connectivity, human ecology, and multiple different range of questions. I do want to preface this talk by saying that I work as part of the database team at Birds Canada on the Motus infrastructure that runs this collaborative network. But the research that I'll be presenting here has all been completed by other users that are leveraging this network to answer their own research questions. So this is the array, the Motus array globally as it stood of last night. And as you can see, it really began in eastern North America here. And I want to start by zooming in there to what the network looks like currently in this area. It has the greatest coverage here. And I want to show you a little bit of what the data that comes back from Motus looks like. So this is one of the original studies that was done, the pilot of Motus that happened in southern Ontario at Long Point in Canada. And I'll just show you here, there are 3 stations of interest here, station A, B, and C. And these arrows are antennae that are attached to the station. So this is fairly complicated, but I'll go through it with you here. This is an example of a black-throated blue warbler with a Motus tag who is on the landscape in this area. And each represents a different antenna. These 4 are station A, this one's station B, and these 4 are station C. So A, B, and C there. And the information within the panel represents the signal strength of the tag. So for example, this bird was hanging around on the west side of station A, so hanging around and being detected on this west-facing antenna here. And this variation in signal strength is it's going about its day, moving around, foraging. And then here, this more steady signal strength is it roosting at night. So we have daytime, nighttime changes in activity. And then we're just going to zoom in on this region here in this second plot. So these are the same things, just a little bit closer temporally. And as you can see, the bird is going about its day, and then it rests for a little while after sunset. This black bar is sunset. And then you see this sharp increase in signal strength. That is a migratory flight. So that's a takeoff and flying quite high, which increases your detectability. And then it flies along, and then you start to decrease your ability to detect that bird on the west antenna, but you detect it more on the south antenna, and then you begin detecting it on antenna B, so that's this one here, and then over to C, and then eventually you get it on the north antenna of C, the east and west about the same time, and then we peter off on the south antenna. So what that looks like is essentially a bird flying south, which, you know, is not revolutionary information, but these fine-scale movements can be informative for making management decisions. So from now that you have an understanding of what Motus is, I want to talk about the applications for energy development, specifically wind energy. And to start this off, I'm going to present a case study that was done by Pam Loring at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe you're on the call, so hi Pam, thanks for this. And in this study, the goal was to track flight paths of birds in federal waters and estimate their exposure to potential wind energy areas that may be slated for development of offshore wind energy. They were also looking at the influence of covariates, so demographics, age and sex, time of day, wind, visibility, precipitation on the various weather aspects. And to do this, they used an array on the eastern seaboard of North America. Each one of these sort of blue bubbles represents an antenna on a Motus station set up along the shore here. These bigger bubbles are bigger antenna with a larger radius, and the smaller ones are smaller antenna with a smaller radius. And then these areas are different potential wind energy development. And they deployed these small nanotags on red knots at 4 different study sites. So James Bay, Mingan Island, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And so this is a cool example of multiple different populations being tracked and determining which populations might be impacted by your study area. They did a 3D movement model using the signal strengths and the receiving pattern of the array. And from there, they were actually able to get information on not just a bird detected here and then a bird subsequently detected here, but flight paths, direction, speed, and timing. And from those, they estimated the exposure to various wind energy areas. So you can see these are 2 birds from the Mingan Islands. This one crossed this wind energy area, and this one crossed this wind energy area. And this is exposure in real time, which is a bit better than using mortality data, where you need to try and estimate when between search intervals the mortality occurred. And this is also looking at live birds, so there's not yet an impact. It also is something that you can break down by source populations. For example, these are the number of exposure events for the different populations that were tracked in this study. So as you can see here, the New Jersey birds were exposed to these wind energy areas far more than the James Bay or Mingan Island birds. And that can be really helpful for determining which populations might be impacted by a development, especially when there are different population concerns surrounding different locations. They also looked at covariance, so they were able to show that peak exposure to wind energy areas happened in November, primarily at night, and during moderate southeast winds. So a lot of this information that you can get when you know exactly when the bird would have been exposed to the area. So this was an example of one of the first uses of Motus to assess offshore wind energy development, and that has since grown into a collaborative effort which is happening over the next couple of years. So this is the development of monitoring protocols for nanotag studies at offshore wind farms. And funding is provided to the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and it's a collaborative effort with a few different objectives. One is to develop a framework for standardizing nanotag monitoring. So that includes transmitter options, receiver options, data interpretation, and informing assessments, and then integration of the Motus nanotag technology with other technologies, so radar, satellite, etc. The next objective will be to create an online study design tool. So this would be a free tool in R-Shiny, which will help optimize site-specific study designs. So in this case, if you had a question about a certain area, you would input some parameters, number of turbines, size, that sort of thing, and then it would help you determine the number of receivers you might need, the best antenna height and orientation, and your approximate detection probability within your area. So a lot of decision support tools for other users looking to complete similar studies. And the third objective would be having a data framework for Motus. So this would be an ability to coordinate and disseminate tracking data specifically for offshore wind turbines. So the generation of quarterly reports provided by us here at the Motus Network, summarizing the information about movements of birds and bats. So this reduces the time between research and publication and makes that data available to the community much sooner. This group is going to have some workshops coming up. The information for these will be distributed shortly and encourage participation. And they also are looking for a project advisory committee to advise the project. So they want to engage lots of different stakeholders, regulators, developers, NGOs, anybody who's interested with the goal of participating in some of those workshops and providing input on species, data, the tool, and to test the tool. So for those interested in participating in this effort or getting more information, you can contact Pamela Loring, and her email will be included in the PDF of this presentation. So another application is the study of movement ecology of bats using Motus. And Motus is increasingly popular for bats. Over 1,000 tags have now been deployed on bats in North America. And this was one of the early studies of bat movements using Motus. In this case, we're going back to that same area where I showed you the first example, Southern Ontario, and taking a look at some of the bat movements for some silver-haired, eastern red, and hoary bats that were tagged at Long Point and in the fall. And as you can see movement that's slightly different than that which we see of birds, and I'm eagerly awaiting more publications to come out of this data. And it provides some information on emergence and departure timing, so we know exactly when a bat became active and exactly when a bat left the area. Again, you can see this is a bat resting, then a bat moving about, and then a bat leaving this antenna, passing this antenna, and passing this antenna. You can also look at dispersal distances and direction from colonies. For example, this is information on little brown myotis at a maternity colony and looking at how far these animals are moving from the colony center. And in these cases, we get a good sense of how individuals from one colony are using the surrounding landscape. So in terms of applications for renewable energy, there are a lot when it comes to Motus. Assessments of site use pre and post-construction and how they may change with the installation of a wind energy facility is one that is being investigated. Distance traveled from roof sites, home range sizes, and appropriate setbacks. Understanding site level activity patterns, so temperature, wind speed, and timing to help inform mitigation practices. And then a broader look at migratory connectivity, corridors, and populations. So I'd like to zoom out again and look at that last one in the context of the larger network. So this is the North American network as it stands at the moment. It's winter, so there's a few less stations than are usually online in spring. Some of these go up right before the spring season. So the last one, in order to look at those broad-scale migratory questions for bats, we need to facilitate the detection of species beyond local studies, which requires a continued expansion of the network. And the wind energy industry can play a role in this expansion, either through the direct installation of Motus stations, which could be a really substantial and economical contribution to research and conservation. You can imagine the increase in the size of the Motus network and the really complementary increase, if you look at those two maps, that could occur if every wind energy facility also installed a Motus monitoring station. And the Motus monitoring stations cost less than $5,000, so it's a very economical investment to really increase the scope of work that can be done for migratory bat tracking. And there is also the opportunity for various partnerships. There are several groups and researchers that are primed and keen to do more tracking of bats, and opportunities for partnership within the industry exist. For example, in Canada right now, there's an open call for alliance grants. Those match industry funding up to $1 million per year for 5 years, which could be an amazing opportunity to get a large-scale coordinated bat tracking project off the ground. I just wanted to mention that to this community as a potential opportunity. And there's also several local scale projects focusing on bats. For example, this is a project that I'm involved in, installing several Motus stations up in the northeast corner of British Columbia here in Canada, with the goal of tracking little brown myotis and northern myotis in the first year, and then in subsequent years doing some tracking of migratory tree roosting bats. So there's certainly a strong need to understand migratory connectivity and movement ecology of bats on the local and continental scale, and I know several different groups working on this and many individuals who are discussing plans, but there is some need for coordination similar to what we saw with the offshore groups that are looking to coordinate. For that purpose, there's a new Google group that exists specific to those who are interested in Motus backtracking or participating in Motus backtracking. And the link is available there and will be available in the slides that we distribute. And as you saw from the example of the red knot study, having researchers tagging animals in multiple different populations and then determining which are detected within any given area is a really useful tool, especially as we increase our understanding of different bat populations that exist. So just a reminder that Motus is really collaborative. So it expands the scale and scope of everyone's work by sharing that infrastructure and sharing those resources so that my tags are detected on your receivers and your tags are detected on mine, and then we're able to share that information. And in that collaborative spirit, this is just a small subset of the many people who contribute to the Motus network. These are just the ones whose data that I included in this presentation. There's a full list of all of the various partners on our website, and I'm happy to discuss questions now. I think I have maybe a couple minutes left, and in the meantime, we can watch the animation of several years of bat tracking in southern Ontario.
Well, thanks for showing us some nice, interesting videos here while people are thinking of their questions. And we do have a few minutes for questions for Catherine, so if anyone has questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, and I'll give it just a second to see if anyone is typing anything. All right, while folks think about their questions for Catherine, I'm going to jump back to a question for Jill and Chuck. There was a question that came in at the end there asking if you can clarify how long after the construction period did the displacement surveys take place?
Sure. For grassland birds, the percent displacement rate is based on that 5 years post-construction. So I think that answers that question for grassland birds. Chuck's study was a 3-year study. So.
And it looks like Chuck might have dropped off again, so we will.
What was that?
It looks like Chuck might have dropped off the phone again. I don't see him on the webinar anymore.
Yeah, his was a 3-year study. So, and ours, the grassland bird study, we actually have more data beyond 5 years post-treatment, but it didn't fall into the before-after control impact study design. So our average percent displacement of 53% is based only on that years that fell into a BACI type design. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. And now we're going to jump to a question for Catherine. And one person is asking if you could display the BAT Motus group address again. So maybe if we can throw that up on the screen, and then we will also have these slides available on the NWCC website. And a question that came in for you, Catherine, is are Motus antenna able to be mounted on other infrastructure, and are there limitations on that, or do the antenna cause any interference with other equipment?
Yes, they can be mounted on pretty much anything. We have Pam, I believe, is mounting them on some offshore buoys at this point. They're mounted on buildings, they're mounted on pop towers. They're very, very flexible in terms of their design and where they can be installed. And in terms of interference, none that I know of. They're just a listening antenna, so it's not broadcasting or producing sort of any radio noise itself. Occasionally, if you put them in a very noisy environment, there are sometimes just certain areas on the landscape where there's a lot of background radio noise from various frequencies. We've had one or two that we've opted to move because they've just had so much background radio noise that there wasn't really a good chance of getting real detections. Yeah, the only real constraint for where you put them is that just a regular, like picture a TV antenna needs to be able to exist there. And they can be off-grid and have solar panels installed, or they can be on-grid. They can, we have options for using the cellular network to transmit data, using internet to transmit data, or just visit the station and download data on a USB stick. Really the only restrictions that we found was occasionally hurricanes knock them down, which has been unfortunate for us.
Well, nothing you can do about that, probably.
Then we just put them back up.
All right, well, we are out of time for the webinar. There are a few more questions that have come in, both for Jill and Chuck and for Catherine. So if it's okay with the presenters, I think what we'll do is I'll take these questions and I'll send them to you over email. And then if you're able to respond, we can send out the answers to the folks who asked those questions. Does that work for all of you?
That works for me.
Yeah, that works, or I'm happy to stay on for a couple more minutes to answer any questions from people who want to linger.
Okay, why don't we do that for questions for Catherine since you're available. We just had a few come in here that maybe you can address now. And for anyone who needs to drop off, go ahead and do that. If anyone has asked a question who needs to drop off the webinar, you can just type me a little note in the Q&A box and we can get back to you by email. So for those who are leaving, thanks for joining. And Jill, if you need to hop off, that's fine also, and we'll just continue here for another couple minutes to answer these few questions. So Catherine, one of the questions is, did you say that Indiana bats were tagged in Ontario? And if so, is this information publicly available?
Not in Ontario, I don't believe. So you can go onto the Motus website. This is just a list of all of the different bats that have been tagged with Motus. If you go onto the Motus website and under Explore Data, select Species Tagged, you can actually go to Indiana Bat and just click on this project link right here, and it will tell you exactly who deployed those tags and where they were deployed.
Okay, great, very helpful. Another question is, how fine scale on the landscape can an animal's movement be tracked using the Motus?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends a little bit on the array that you opt to put in. So, for example, there are different antennas that you can put on a station. So ones with very broad range will more likely detect individuals, but will have a larger spatial scale. Those with a smaller range will be less likely to detect individuals, but have a much closer spatial range. So you can also place stations very close together on the landscape to get very fine scale movements, or you can create these fences just to catch birds or bats as they move past an array. We do have a position available at the moment for a movement ecologist who's going to start looking into many questions that can be explored using some of the Motus data. And we have Ian Johnson is developing a state-based model for Motus detections at the moment to help take some of those track data and refine them to get at a smaller spatial scale. So lots of work being done at the moment, lots of potential, and lots of flexibility in terms of study design. So if I were looking to, put up an array of small antenna within a project area that have, 500-meter radius, you could actually see a bat moving throughout that area in a very fine scale versus if I wanted to put some up that are much farther apart but have broader detection radius. So the short answer to that is that there are many answers to that because the system is so flexible to answer various research questions.
Great, thank you. And let's take one last question, which is about accessing the Google Bat tracking page. So someone is asking how to access that page and says that when they typed it in, they're getting a message that says the page you requested is invalid. Could you go through one more time how to access that?
Possible that that there's just a, well, why don't I send the link in an email? It's probably they just typed it wrong, because when I click on it here, it does open correctly. So when the email comes out after this webinar, you'll be able to just click on the link and then go and join the group.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. If anyone has other questions that come to mind after the webinar, we can get the questions to our speakers. And a reminder, once again, that we will post the recording of this webinar and the presentation slides with all of the links embedded on the NWCC website, and watch for an update email from NWCC in the next couple of days, letting you know that those are available and with the link to the website. And so with that, I will give a huge thanks to our speakers. Thanks so much for providing these updates. Very interesting. One last reminder that the next NWCC Wildlife Research meeting is December 1st through 4th of 2020, which we are almost in. Crazily enough. And with that, I will log off and say goodbye. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you for joining.